when did the SUMP or environmental protection also in the transport sector start in Germany? When you asked me this question, I must say it was much too late, and I was one of the pioneers. I started studying in the 70s, and we began considering also environmental aspects in our planning processes. In my studies already, namely in North America, I studied how to do integrated master planning processes. At that time, planning all over the world was focusing on either roads, either railroads, sectoral aspects, and we started to develop ideas of how to integrate them and how to come up with master plans. And in Germany we got the first technical guidelines on that in the year 1978. But the guidelines were much further ahead than the planners were further ahead than the political decision makers were. So it was always a conflict in democratic decisions what to consider, the holistic, environmental orientated aspect or just the interest of cars. And the interest of cars were very long the issue in Germany in the 60s, 70s. And then we had the dying of the forests, and that's similar to climatic change discussions nowadays. And then the technical understanding of us engineers for transportation changed, that we came up with more holistic approaches, with more city planning oriented approaches, and the guidelines changed in the 90s. And we started then really focusing on integrated, environmentally orientated planning at the beginning of this century or already in the 90s, and SUMPs got developed then already. In Germany we have a long planning tradition. We had the first guidelines in the 60s. They just focused on car-oriented general transport planning, it was called. And then the next guidelines were called transport development guidelines. And they covered already all the important features SUMPs have. And we were discussing with the development, were not really technical guidelines. We called them recommendation for transport development planning. They were published in the year 2013, the German technical recommendations, and they are very similar to SUMP approaches. They just define it differently according to the old German tradition. So the main features, holistic approach, scenarios instead of forecasts, all that is identical. But the framework for planning in Europe, in let's say central states and a federal state like Germany, are different, so that we defined it typical for German planning actors, and it was maybe formulated a little more technical for experts. First of all, we have to take care that the results of SUMP are accepted by the population. We define SUMP not as a plan you do and then you have to implement it. We define the planning process as a continuum. A city has to work with the stuff for a continuous time on the implementation, and of course it's not just a stiff thing you have to implement, it's a rolling system. Right now in Germany the cities tend to explode. A city like Leipzig, Munich, they have growth rates 2% of the population, and then of course we have to technically also control are the measures still appropriate, which we discovered. The approach has to be goal orientated. In the past we just counted cars and then forecasted how many cars we might have in the future, and according to that we widen streets and such things. That's much too simple. Nowadays we do scenarios, forecasts, not to follow them with measures, but we look what are the outcomes? Is the future positive or negative? When the future is negative, we do something against it. And when we have congestion, we cannot produce with measures induced new traffic. So we have to work more on the issue, how can we avoid traffic? How can we have more transportation with public transportation, more walking, more cycling? This is nothing new, but it needs a theory, it needs explanation. And very, very important in a very general planning process is the understanding of politicians, decision makers, and also of the public. And we have to work on that by cooperative, participatory planning process. Acceptance is the most important thing. And then, of course, when you do SUMP, you do not produce it for the drawer. It has to be a living instrument. And very, very important is that the measures you plan follow your strategy, your goals, and that right away you have the money ready in the budget. And the administration people have lots of tricks how to get money together. I was head of a transportation unit in the city of Bremen in the 90s. And we did a SUMP already in the beginning of the 90s. And 5 years later, when the results were kind of old and I had the task to build a big street somewhere or a streetcar somewhere, then I used the project money of that, took a percentage out of that, let's say 10% out of that for planning, and with that money I was then actualizing the old results and always completing their former SUMP. Well, in many years I observed how cooperation in the cities varies to a great extent. And where we have situations where we have the administration, they work among themselves, they are very in a hierarchy organized, and the people who do the work are not allowed to talk to the politicians. Now, I believe in project planning and to define projects with the politicians so that the knowledge and understanding of the politicians to find compromises and to find holistic solutions is available. In the parliament, the members of parliament believe more the nodding of their colleagues than the preaching of the administration. That is one approach, communication, talk to each other. Then the organization of a SUMP is also very important. In the city of here in Berlin and also in Dresden, we came up, of course, with a working team, the consultants and the experts from the administration. At the same time, we had a round table with all the different interest groups of society. And in this round table, there were also the politicians, and they saw how discussion goes. For instance, it was very interesting. The politicians were arguing against each other about goals. But the different sectors from the society very soon found what goals do we have to follow, and so the goals could be decided since the politicians didn't dare anymore to say something against the consensus of the society. Another thing was we also had, of course, ideological thinking in the political parties and with the decision makers. Very important for the SUMP process here in Berlin and also in Dresden was that they had a scientific advisory board. And when there were different opinions, it was much easier for the scientists of the scientific advisory board to go into the parties or into the parliament and explain. I always say, since I was in the administration myself, the preacher is not worth anything in his own country. So when you get an external expert, his job is much easier. And no politician dares to argue in public against a professor or a well-known expert. Yeah, we have a big discussion in theory and practice whether we need regulated SUMPs, required SUMPs, or whether we should have them more loose as a kind of volunteer instrument. That depends, of course, on the national framework. It's different in each country. I'm very much in favor using SUMPs as a volunteer instrument, very flexible, and come up with approaches, methods, and theories that fit to the location. Yeah. Vienna, for instance, everybody praises the achievements of Vienna. They do not only have good mobility planning, they also have good results. 39% public transportation modal split is extraordinary for a European city. How did they do that? They developed very sensitive planning methods where also this, for me, important issue, knowledge and understanding was spread out to politicians and to citizens. And for all the measures, they had so-called fairness checks. And with these making clear how that it was a fair plan, that one thought of everybody, the acceptance was much better. In my experience as a planner, I very often had to conclude when I worked very good with my people in the agency, and I came up with solutions and presented solutions to the public and to the people. They were out of principle against it because they were not included in the planning process. And it took me a lot of effort to make my people understand that the best approach is to go to the first public hearing with no solutions, but with the results of the problem analysis. And you tell the people, we found out this is good, this is bad. Do you agree? And we can think in this direction to improve the situation. Do you agree? What are your ideas? And they get the feeling they help. And then when you come with solutions or measures and suggest them, you can say, I did that because you said that, and you said that and that. And the degree of acceptance is quite different. Planning is not just top-down. Planning is a process with each other, and we all have to struggle and find solutions, and that are compromises, of course. It's better for the experts, engineers, for them it's very hard to accept that. It's better to achieve 60 or 70% of what technically is possible instead of not 100% because you do not find the political agreement on that. Well, we always say SUMP has to consider all the integration factors, integration of all the different modes of the population, etc. And I talk a lot about integrated measure. Engineers last century only thought of technical measures, but very important are land use measures, where we locate the uses, where is housing, where are the offices. And we want mixed uses. Those are traditional good measures to avoid traffic. New is mobility as a service, and I believe very strongly in the approach to increase the number of car sharing, etc. Scientifically, that is very important because the decisions before the daily decision, how do I travel, that are much more important is the decision, where do I live, far out of the city, and do I buy a car or not. And all the people who do not buy a car, they have a totally different transport behavior. They use public transportation 3 times more than people who have a car available. And that's a problem with evaluation mobility as a service, with those measures. When you do surveys in home-based service, or on car-sharing cars, and ask the people, how did you travel before? Then of course they say public transportation or use the car or so. And then very soon you have the modes arguing against each other, and public transportation is always afraid that there could be cannibalization of his customers. It's much more difficult to come up with a real true, which is more indirect, because we have to come up with measures and evaluation procedures that discover that when you do not own a car, you have a totally different behavior, and this behavior is much better for the city and the environment. We use more our feet, we use more our cycling, we go 3 times more, we use public transportation, and instead of a modal split of 60% for cars, when I have access to one, I have only 20% modal split for cars. That's a huge difference. So we have a potential of 3 times less cars in our cities. Think of a country like Germany with more than 40 million cars. If we would only have 10 million or 20 million cars in our cities, how much space and how much more quality of life we would have if we would consider these approaches more realistic, not so just the immediate effects. Politicians like to believe that when you improve public transportation, then public transportation gets more customers. The example of Vienna shows, of course that's right, you need good public transportation, otherwise you cannot convince people to use it. But at the same time, experts call it push and pull measures. You need measures so that people are not encouraged to use the car, that they are discouraged to use the car. And in Vienna, citywide now they plan to have parking managed. When you park your car, you have to pay for it. It's about 25 square meters for your car, you cannot get for free. We have market prices for especially valuable land. And when you have to pay more for using the car than you pay for using public transportation, then the decision is much easier to use a car. Public transportation pass in Vienna costs €1 per day, and that's cheaper than using the car. That's one approach. Another example is the city of Freiburg in Germany. All the cities have a degree of motorization. Rich cities like Munich or Frankfurt, we have more than 400 cars per 1,000 inhabitants. And when you buy a car for €40,000, you want to use it. You don't want to just have it parked somewhere outside of the city maybe. Here in Berlin, with a different social structure, also the wall during socialist times did a little bit. We have only 300 cars per 1,000 people, so Berlin and Munich are totally different, even though the modal split values are similar. In the city of Freiburg, we have 408 cars per 1,000 people. And in Freiburg, about 15 years ago, also 20 years ago, they built new residential areas with different approaches than in other cities. You cannot park in those new residential areas. Vauban is the best example. That was a former French barracks. You cannot park your car in your own house. You must park your car, if you own one, in a garage that is assigned to the quarter you live in. So you like using public transportation, you always have 200 or 150 or 300 meters to walk to your car. If you do, in Germany, when you build new houses, you have to build parking places. And that is a rule we don't like anymore. In Freiburg, they tried the approach when you buy a house or rent a house and you do not own a car, you do not have to buy the parking place for €30,000, or you do not have to rent the parking place in the garage for €200 per month. And the motorization in this new residential area of Vauban is not 407 like the rest of Freiburg, it is 150. There are only 150 cars in that neighborhood per 1,000 people. And of course, the travel behavior of these people is totally different. It's a very, very good example for ecological planning. Freiburg started in the 90s with developing a first big area. It's called Rieselfeld. Anybody who wants to go there as a tourist. And then the second, this best example in my opinion, it's called Vauban, the part of the section of Freiburg-Vauban, only 150 people. And now there is a new planning process for the city of Dietenbach. They are expanding the first section. And one very important thing in Freiburg is also, Vienna does it too that way, whenever you build new residential complexes for many people, first of all, you build the streetcar or the subway into this area so that people do not get used to the idea, I have to buy a car in order to get from A to B. Germany is a federal state, and the federal government is not allowed to regulate local decisions, and they are not even allowed to give federal money directly to communities. It all has to go run through the states. That's one thing that got changed only 10 years ago. Before that was different. I think we have to develop the right approach in all the states individually. Also in Germany, where the federal government is not allowed to interfere locally, I think it would be brilliant and a good idea to come up with a federal plan to support SUMPs as the state of the art of planning. And that should be communicated by the federal government and by also the states. Sometimes the question is asked, should we make SUMPs required and require them? Without SUMP you are not allowed to build roads and infrastructure. We have already a legal framework for planning in Germany, which was developed for more than 50 years. And we have required plans. They are called formal plans, land use plans, and also air and air pollution plans, noise plans. My experience is whenever they are required, the approaches are very stiff and formal. But we need very open and participatory SUMP approaches. And for the German framework, I am an advocate for leaving the transportation planning process, the umbrella transportation process, also the city development umbrella planning process, open and flexible as a so-called informal planning process, a continuum in the administration, consider it as state of the art. I always refer to the required plans in Germany on land use planning. And there it's required that land use planning cannot be done without professional transport planning. And in that respect, I always indicate that SUMP is a required part of land use planning, and as such we should consider it and deal with it. Yeah, I have an ambivalent attitude towards funding and getting money from the government. I think the planning processes, when you look back, very often did not plan those things that were necessary and good. They planned the things for which they got money. The administration got money from above. So it's better to make the cities independent so that they can do independently what's good for them. We have an average number that a SUMP might cost €1 per inhabitant. But it depends on how you plan and how complex your planning procedures are. It might be more, it might be less. When you consider SUMP as a rolling system that has to be done all the time, it's much more important to have a staff in your city that conducts the monitoring system, collects the data, so that you have always control over your processes, and then you can adjust. Like in Belgium, where you have to adjust the last SUMP every 6 years, it's a rolling system. In our technical guidelines, we have recommendations how it should be done like that on stages. When I was responsible in the city of Bremen, we came up after the SUMP was finished in 1993. 5 years later, we had big investments that were possible. And what I did then, with the investment planning for these projects, big traffic generators, I got all the actors for SUMP in a conclave for 2 days, and we discussed the results of the SUMP, whether they are still actual, and what we plan, whether it fits into the SUMP, and then we did a reverse development and continuation of the SUMP and fitted this project into it, and out of that it resulted how to change the SUMP so that one can be flexible and do the things that are necessary at the time. And so you can take money out of the projects also to then forecast and to actualize the SUMP. The federal government made me plan a freeway around the city of Bremen, very costly measure, and out of that I got lots of millions for planning, and these millions are used to actualize the SUMP. Yeah, as a result of our discussion, I think what to experts is very clear that without planning we don't get proper results. And it's very important that in the cities you increase knowledge and understanding, and that you know that without planning you lose and waste an awful lot of money, and you don't get A and B together. So sectoral thinking always causes unwanted side effects, and integrated approaches like SUMP is one, minimizes costs and has goals which should be decided locally, at least in Germany, that focus more on the people than on the car. And I'm happy when my people I work for are happy. I don't feel so much when only cars are happy. They really are not happy. They just stand around and are not used. Thank you.